Good morning or afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another SafetyChain 2014 Leadership webinar. And today's topic, Creating HACCP Excellence, What to Do, What Not to Do, and Best Practices from an Industry Insider, featuring Bob Savage, who's the president of HACCP Consulting Group, and we'll be telling you a little bit more about Bob in just a few moments here. Before we jump into our topic, let me give you some important housekeeping announcements. First, I'm Barbara Levin. I'm your host. I will be interviewing Bob today and giving you a little bit of additional information at the end of the webinar. Before we introduce Bob, let me give you a couple of housekeeping announcements. We are hosting this webinar today on the WebEx platform. Should you have any technical issues, if you are still online, you can try to go out of full screen and send a chat to our host. If you are unable to do that, you can call WebEx technical support directly at 877-509-3239. Again, that's 877-509-3239. A copy of the recording as well as the slides will be sent to all registrants by the end of the day Monday. You'll get an email that will allow you to download both of those. We will be doing QA online at the end of the formal part of the presentations. We'll come out of full screen and show you then how you can enter your questions. Also, for your privacy, you can see the names of the host and the panelists and your name only. You cannot see the names of the other attendees. So with that, we're going to start today with an interview with Bob Savage. Some of the topics that we're going to be addressing are management commitment, the role of good manufacturing practices in a HACCP program, overall best practices, what makes an effective CCP, monitoring, verification, and validation, audit preparedness, and talk a little bit about the future of HACCP in the light of FSMA-HARPC. I'm then going to give you just some very high-level information about how automation can help you with a robust HACCP program, and then we're going to open it up for the questions. So with that, I am just so excited to have Bob Savage with us today. HACCP Consulting Group is a partner of SafetyChain. Bob has been in over 20 countries to provide food safety and regulatory training to countries that want to import into the U.S. He has a very long career with FDA and USDA, FSIS, and every time I talk to Bob, I hear just more gems of wisdom. And I think that when you look at this career, to say the least, he's seen it all when it comes to HACCP programs and HACCP audits and more. So we're very, very excited to have him here today. I'm going to start with the topics that we just discussed on the agenda and ask Bob to share some of that insight and wisdom and experience with us. And then we're going to make sure that all of you have time to pick Bob's brain a little bit as well. So with that, Bob, welcome. And very, very excited to have you here.
Okay, thanks a lot, Barbara, and thanks for that nice introduction. And good morning or good afternoon to everyone. Excited.
And we're going to just jump right in. So,
okay.
You know, Bob, when you and I talk about HACCP programs, and we've had a couple of conversations here, one of the things that I hear you talk about over and over again is management commitment. And I think some people might take this for granted, but not always. So I was hoping that you can share with us your insight on the importance of management commitment in a HACCP program, and how do you go about setting measurable expectations? And you know I'm going to ask you to tell us a story at the end.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I'd be glad to. Based on many years of experience in working with the industry on developing and implementing HACCP plans and HACCP systems, it's very obvious that management has to be committed to the program in numerous ways. They have to provide resources for people to develop the plans and implement the plans, as well as provide for training and ensure that their commitment is communicated, throughout the company, both verbally and in writing, so that everyone's aware that upper management is committed to food safety.
Mm-hmm. Bob, I've heard you talk a lot about what you call a culture of food safety in a company. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Well, again, everyone needs to understand their roles and responsibilities as far as producing a safe product, and oftentimes be rewarded for having that capability. But the culture of food safety is just paramount to any company to move forward in developing and implementing HACCP, so that it meets regulatory requirements. And certainly now, with the advent of the explosion, if you will, of the GFSI schemes such as Safe Quality Foods, this is an integral part of their programs as well, to obtain upper management commitment to developing these programs and implementing them properly.
What do you have to say to the companies that, get that, but, as we know, food is very, it's a low profit margin to begin with, and, management struggles between getting product out and, staying in the KPIs and having it be safe? What would you say to companies that have that struggle?
Well, having that struggle is not a good recipe for the future, because certainly as things have evolved, certainly with FSMA and all the regulations now associated with HACCP, if there's not compliance with these programs, then companies that aren't committed to them are destined to have some issues and problems. So it really is important to understand what's required and be committed to implement it properly.
When we were preparing for this webinar, you told me an anecdote of management commitment going awry. Maybe you can share that with us.
Well, I think probably a lot of people on the webinar are familiar with the situation back a few years ago with peanut butter, and very serious salmonella outbreak. About 700 people became ill, and I believe 9 had died. And it would appear that it was a situation where companies shopped around for negative salmonella results and then shipped the product. So certainly that's a worst case scenario for sure, but obviously something that drove the plant to be more concerned with short-term profitability than long-term needs, and it resulted in the serious illness outbreak and deaths and bankruptcy of the company, and also led to about 3,000 secondary recalls where their peanut butter product had been used in other items. So it's just a massive problem.
It's really a matter of that. Don't do as I say, do as I do, and making sure that it's from the top down, right? Don't show up at the plant not wearing the same protective gear as the people that work in the plant have to wear. I think is some good advice there. We talk about good manufacturing practices and the role in creating and minimizing CCPs, because our goal isn't to have so many CCPs that it's hard to monitor. Can you talk about this and what companies should be doing when it comes to GMPs to make sure that their CCPs are just the number they need and that they're the right ones?
Sure. We'll see a pyramid in a subsequent slide, but again, the base of the pyramid is what we've already talked about, a management commitment. that supports everything above that. And kind of the next level is for companies to make certain they have well-developed good manufacturing practices, well-written prerequisite programs associated with the GMPs, that these are being monitored and controlled properly. Otherwise, it becomes a lot more difficult to develop and implement a HACCP plan. And most oftentimes, companies wind up with a lot more CCPs than they should because of lack of good manufacturing practices.
What's a sample or example of, what is a type of GMP that can actually eliminate a critical control point?
Well, one might be, and it's somewhat controversial, is metal detection. And I always look at that as dependent on the plant's results. There's always a discussion of whether metal detection should be a critical control point or operated through a prerequisite program. And my answer to that is generally dependent on the plant's history and the plant in-plant data. If the company has a history of metal contamination, customer complaints and the like, then it's hard to say the hazard is not reasonably likely to occur. If, on the other hand, there's no evidence or very little evidence that they have a metal contamination problem, it can be operated as a prerequisite program. And those are the judgments that the companies have to make and be able to support when it comes to a third-party audit or a regulatory audit.
What, a lot of companies, especially the FDA plants, are kind of looking now and saying, well, what am I going to have to do with my FSMA plan to start to, or excuse me, my HACCP plan to maybe move toward HARP-C? This is an actually opportune time for these companies when it comes to their GMPs, isn't it? Yes,
absolutely. I get lots of calls from companies, wanting to develop a HACCP plan, and through talking with them, oftentimes I learn that they either don't have good GMP programs or have them at all. And I always recommend that they start with developing and implementing good GMP programs. And of course, through FSMA and the preventive controls proposed regulations, they have updated their GMP programs requirements so that the companies have a pretty good window now to step back and look to see that their GMP programs are well developed and implemented in place, so that they won't have to worry about that come time to start developing their other programs.
Right. And we've seen people go from the extremes too, right? From having too many CCPs to not having enough or not having any. What are some of the most common ones that the company should really, obviously it's a little bit different for every company, but, what are some of the most common ones that companies want to make sure that they have a good measurable CC in place for?
Sure. Well, some of the obvious ones certainly is for cooking a product, for example, what we consider a ready-to-eat product to be, and certainly another one kind of associated with that process would be cooling or chilling down that cooked product to prevent any outgrowth of another pathogen that would be a concern. So, certainly cooking and chilling are major critical control points for any of that type of process.
Mm-hmm. So you've seen a lot of HACCP plans. You've seen a lot of CCPs. Any stories that you can share of people that did a great job, or maybe something that we should be avoiding?
Well, I recall one incident that working with a company that had a grand total of 25 critical control points in their HACCP plan, and certainly having that number is just absolutely impossible to manage and deal with. And going back to what we just talked about, the main reason was that they didn't have any GMP programs, so they made everything a critical control point. So typically, if things are done right and companies understand the relationship between GMPs and a HACCP program and CCPs, typically a HACCP plan probably would not have more than 2 or 3 or 4 critical control points, and everything else dealt with through prerequisite GMP programs.
Okay, interesting. So let's take a step back then. I know that those management commitment and GMPs, for you are the real foundations. But you mentioned your pyramid before, and we have it up on this slide. I know that you and HACCP Consulting Group uses this a lot. Maybe you can, walk us through this, because this really outlines, what the best practices are to have that world-class HACCP program.
Sure. Again, we've already discussed the management commitment and the prerequisite programs and GMPs. Certainly a major program or element within the GMPs is a sanitation standard operating procedure for sanitation of the facilities. It's a little different between FDA and FSIS as to what their requirements are in the FSIS world. For the meat and poultry industry, it's mandatory that companies have a written SSOP program that deals with sanitation, cleaning and sanitation of direct food contact surfaces and equipment as part of their daily procedures. So that is another level that helps support the HACCP plan. We can put in other components here as well. Other quality control programs might also have a place here in helping support HACCP. HACCP, as we've learned over the years, does not replace everything we do in the company. There are other programs that are necessary to help support it.
The companies are looking to revamp their HACCP programs right now. They shouldn't be starting with the CCPs then, right? You start at the bottom of this period.
That's right. That's right. I would suggest they step back and look at their GMP programs to make sure that those are well developed and implemented and managed, and that what is in place for GMP programs still can be used as part of justifications in the HACCP plan hazard analysis.
And none of it makes any difference if there's not follow through. What are best practices for follow through? What are some of the things companies should be doing?
Follow through in terms of developing or
well, in terms of developing, and then in terms of making sure that they're working.
Yeah, one of the big benefits I've seen in companies moving into one of the Global Food Safety Initiative programs like Safe Quality Foods is that it's mandatory that companies do internal audits, and I think that's very, very helpful and informative to identify problems on their own, basically, without having a third party or a regulator come in and do it, that they identify areas that may need to be addressed and strengthened in advance of other people looking at it. So
I know that you're really into the multidisciplinary teams, right? We've spoken about this, and when I saw some of the information that we discussed while we were prepping, obviously understand QC and QA, and I was surprised to see that you strongly recommend that sales become a part of that team that's putting together or revamping plans. You had a great story that you told me on why you want to make sure sales is included. the trigger, my notes, I remember to ask you about the salami, Bob.
Yeah, yes, right. Well, I'm a strong believer. One of the greatest concepts within HACCP is the development of a HACCP team. In the years of working with the industry, I've really never seen any one person in a company that has all the knowledge that's necessary to develop an adequate HACCP plan. So a multidisciplinary team, as the slide indicates, with these different people being represented, really helps build a much, much better and stronger HACCP plan. And with their involvement, it also helps with the commitment. If one person develops the plan and puts it out into the factory, no one's committed to it. So it's, we call it buy-in. You get buy-in by having a multidisciplinary team. And part of the team members should maybe come from product development. They're developing products which may, challenge adequacy of a HACCP plan. They may have to make changes to it. If, for example, they would use a allergenic ingredient and the company hadn't considered allergens in the past, and salespeople, they're out marketing your products and agreeing to things that perhaps might be very difficult for production to implement quickly. The one story I always go back to is the application of a black pepper spice rub on a salami product after the process without apparently the company knowing that the black pepper was contaminated with salmonella. And, of course, it resulted in another foodborne illness outbreak. And, that was a situation where, certainly the hazard analysis wasn't done properly.
Right. So CCPs, right? You talked about companies that have that have 24 of them. That's not, manageable, as you said. And we want the CCPs to really be effective. So what insight and best practices can you share to help us understand what makes an acceptable critical control point?
Well, you really have to go back to the hazard analysis and doing a thorough job in conducting that step in the HACCP principles so that you can, clearly identify what, in fact, in your process should be a critical control point. Remember, the definition is, a step in the process where you can prevent, eliminate, or reduce to acceptable levels a hazard. So, that's a very, very important definition, and only through doing a good hazard analysis can you, zero in, if you will, on where exactly your CCP should be.
Excuse me. Talk about science-based, right? I mean, obviously, we want our CCPs to be science-based, but where does that come in? And then, are all CCPs science-based, or do some come through, through trending or other processes that are involved?
Yeah, well, science-based, it kind of goes to something we'll talk about a little bit in a minute, and that's validation. Certainly, in identifying critical control point, the critical limits associated with the CCP to identify that you're controlling the hazards have to be science-based, and companies need to have references to those critical limits that can be used as supporting data. On occasion, there might be some situations where it could be a sensory critical limit, like a visual inspection or something of that nature, but Generally, we're looking for quantitative measurement, something like a time or temperature or pH or water activity, something that can be measured and something that can be measured with a calibrated instrument, for example, rather than qualitative, such as visual or something of that nature. So it really needs the critical limits really need to be science-based.
Okay, sure. And I know we're gonna get to that in a minute.
Right.
Great to share that you've seen where people have done a great job of effective CCPs, or maybe not so much.
Well, we have a real good client that does a lot of cooked, ready-to-eat products that they have spent a great deal of money and time and effort in validating their processes to, demonstrate that the controls and critical limits that they have in place are adequate. So that's just an outstanding way to do it. So very.
So they have to be continuously looked at, right? You don't just come up with CCPs and
no,
take it
right.
to make sure that they're effective. I think that's leading us into it's really funny. We speak about this. There's still a lot of confusion, right, in the industry between what is verification, what is validation. But when it comes to making sure that your CCPs are effective, they have to be monitored, they have to be verified, and they have to be validated. What are best practices? What should every company that's joined us here today make sure that they're doing to make sure that those CCPs are working?
Right. Well, everyone seems to understand and deal with monitoring pretty well. You identify a critical control point and you have your critical limits, and someone's assigned to monitor compliance with those critical limits at a certain frequency. So that's pretty well understood. Verification, on the other hand, seems to still be a little more difficult concept to understand. And the way I look at it is verification is a check of the checkers. Company has somebody monitoring the CCP and the critical limits. You want to have somebody different than that person come through and verify that they're doing it correctly. And you can look at verification as a check of the checkers. Or another way of looking at it is, do we say what we do, and do we do what we say? Do we say what we do in the HACCP plans, and do we say what we do on the floor in implementing it? So that's really verification. It's done by a different person, done at a different frequency, and maybe the same or different activities that, from the monitoring person. Now, validation, you kind of ask another question, is it the right thing to do? Do we have the right CCPs, and do we have the right critical limits, and so on? And can we prove it? And that's the tough part. A lot of my background is in the canning industry, low-acid canned food industry, where the validation procedures for the thermal process for low-acid canned foods was developed way back in the 1920s. So everyone knows in that industry how to validate the adequacy of the thermal process. We certainly moved well beyond the canning industry these days, and some processes are more difficult to know exactly how to validate them.
I've heard you. I made sure I put this on the slide so I can make sure that I can ask you about it. But I've heard you say before that the boundaries of safety should be around the critical limits and then the CCPs. Can you explain to us what
Well, the critical limits are what we call boundaries of safety. They're brackets, if you will, around the critical control point, so that if you fail, to meet that critical limit, then the product could be potentially hazardous, and you have to, according to HACCP principles, obviously, take, predetermined corrective actions to deal with the deviation. But there are a set point where critical limit tells you whether your process is in or out of control. And obviously, if it's out of control, then you have to take necessary corrective actions for it.
That makes sense. Any stories to share about monitoring and verification and validation? Again, I think the big challenge for the industry in implementing FSMA rules, and even for companies that currently have HACCP plans, is to revisit their programs to make sure that they have good supporting documentation for their critical limits and the HACCP program in general. Great. Let's move to audits. Top front of mind for a lot of companies. In the end, all of this has to pass an audit. So can you tell us a little bit about audits, the types, and what are best practices that you can share with our audience today to make sure that they are ready for and can pass audits on their HACCP programs?
Yeah. Well, we can maybe talk a little about the difference between FDA and USDA. Obviously, in USDA, regulating the meat and poultry industry, there's an inspector in the plant every day, some plants all day, other plants at some frequency during the day. And they actually have tasks to perform that verify that what the company says in their programs is what they do. And that's kind of routinely done day after day. USDA has another team or teams of inspection personnel that are more highly trained that come in and actually do what's called a food safety assessment. And there they look at the whole food safety system within the plants, and that can take days or weeks to complete. So, really companies under USDA really need to do their own food safety assessment well in advance of FSIS doing it. So that when FSIS does come in, they're pretty well in good shape. FDA regulated plants, on the other hand, obviously don't see an inspector every day, and it may be months or years, perhaps, so that companies really have to take the bull by the horns and do their own internal audits, or have somebody work with them prior to their having third-party audits, such as SQF or other audits.
Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about GFSI. I know that you think that if a company gets certified on a GFSI scheme, that's going to get you really close to where you need to be for best practices. Can you share some thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely, Barbara. The GFSI schemes have certainly taken hold in the U.S. and as well as around the world. Different parts of the world use different schemes, but certainly here in the U.S., the predominant one seems to be the Safe Quality Foods program, and certainly companies that have implemented that SQF scheme should have probably no problems with, meeting the requirements of FDA in the new regulations, and of course the foundation for the SQF program is HACCP as well. So companies moving in that direction certainly have a leg up on everybody else, if you will. They should be well within compliance of anything dealing with the FSMA rules.
And we know that you and the folks at HACCP Consulting Group are strong believers in leveraging technology. You're a partner of SafetyChain. How can companies be leveraging technology to help them with audit prep? I'm going to address it later, but but if you can share your thoughts there.
Yeah, I think one of the big things I see is companies, certainly are keeping the records that are required and necessary, but they're not making use of the data on the records. They're not using the data to make process improvements. And I think certainly with the SafetyChain software, this would become much more manageable to learn from the records, track and trend the data so that if there's a trend toward having more failures, for example, either in the HACCP plan or in GMP programs, that companies can take action before it becomes a bigger problem. So companies...
Any audits, great stories or nightmares that you want to share with
probably, and this was several years ago, I must admit, and probably the worst situation I have seen dealing with listeria problem. We were asked to come into a company that had probably the worst listeria problem I've ever seen, and they had somewhat like a total of 22 lots of finished product on hold because of listeria contamination, and the plant management couldn't really understand why they had the problem. And the reason they couldn't understand it was that behind his desk was several picture frames with nice certificates in there, audit certificates with glowing scores, and yet they were sitting on this huge listeria problem. So companies have to do what's right on their own, and in the past at least, these audits were just a real quick snapshot of the operation, and I think over the years with GFSI now and the Safe Quality Foods programs and others, the audits have become more rigorous, more focused. They're using more highly trained people to conduct the audits, so that in coming into a facility that would be susceptible to their products being susceptible to listeria contamination, that's what they would focus on.
So before we go into the next part of our presentations and then get to questions, it's trade show season in food safety, and I've been to a lot of them recently, and if you ask 10 people what the future of HACCP is going to be given HARP-C, I've gotten 10 answers. So I'd like to know yours.
Well, I certainly see a bright future, if you will, for HACCP. It's been an evolving thing since way back in the 1970s, with canning being the first application, and then seafood processing, and then of course meat and poultry processing, and now virtually all the rest of the commodities will come under HACCP. So this is a internationally recognized food safety system, and it's not going to go away. So companies that don't have it already certainly need to start moving in that direction, even in advance of any additional regulations to get a head start.
And I know that you always say that you can't be afraid of CCPs or eliminate processes, right?
That's right. There's a purpose for having critical control points to address controls that are necessary to keep your product safe. So you can't be afraid of them.
Right. Well, Bob, thank you for this information. What we're going to do now, first I am going to take us out of full screen. Everybody now should be able to see on the right-hand side of their screen at the bottom a Q&A tab. And I can see that we already have a lot of questions, and we'll stay on for a couple of extra minutes if we need to try to get to as many of these as possible. To submit a question, simply enter it into the lower right-hand Q&A box there and hit send. It looks like some questions have come through on the chat. If you put yours there, I can see that, but it's hard to get to. So if you're entering your questions now, use Q&A, and we'll get to those. Before we do that, I'm going to just take a few minutes to talk about how you can leverage technology to manage a really robust HACCP or HARP-C program. And, you know, from all of the information that Bob has just shared, you know, when it comes to managing programs, there really are, you know, some challenges there. And you see that, you know, we've got this person in this storm of paper, and that certainly is one of the challenges, is, you know, making sure that the right forms are being used and making sure that you can get the information that you need for audit readiness, making sure that there's consistency in your programs, that the tasks that are associated with your CCPs and your GMPs are taking place, that you're getting information in a timely manner so that you can solve the problem. Making sure that when there's new requirements has always been a challenge of making sure that everybody in the organization, you know, is using the most current practices. And, you know, so much is on paper that it's very hard to do that trending and that risk assessment and finding the ways for continuous improvement. But there are technologies in place today that can help you, and one of those is a food safety chain management system. I'm going to very briefly, you know, tell you how these work. If you'd like to see a demo of our food safety chain management system, we've got a demo day coming up. You can register for that on our website. But at the highest level, a food safety chain management system really covers those 4 areas that Bob outlined when it comes to monitoring and verification and validation. These systems really are designed to help you say what you do what you say, make sure it works, and make sure it's documented. So all requirements for your programs can be set up in an FSCMS, whether those are regulatory requirements, whether those are your GFSI code, your customer specs, and your internal requirements. Also, what can be set up in the system are all of the documentations and processes that are required to support those requirements. So your critical control points and your prerequisite programs and your preventive controls and all the Ps, the GMPs, the SOPs, the GAPs, for example, all of those are set up in the system, including things like supplier documentation, information from labs. A food safety chain management system then has a workflow engine. So all of the tasks that are associated with your HACCP and HARP-C programs can get scheduled, the workflow in the proper order. Notifications go out when tasks are due. Bob mentioned metal detection. If metal detectors have to be calibrated at a certain time on certain lines every morning, those notifications go out. All of the test results, notifications go out when something's due. Then there's that verification engine and validation engine. All of the information that's coming into the system is being analyzed in real time. If there's a nonconformance, this can be a pathogen test. This can be a document from a supplier that isn't due. This can be a component of your sanitation program that wasn't done. Real-time alerts go out. All of this information, every form, every test result, every notification that went out, every nonconformance in CAPA, everything is documented with unalterable time and date stamps. So this gives you 3 real components here. It gives you accessible, actionable data in a central repository of data for trending and continuous improvement. All of your documents are there. They're audit ready. And you have peace of mind knowing that you are having your programs followed and that they're working. So the key benefits there for your HACCP or your HARP-C program is the workflow of all of your processes is automated. However many CCPs, and Bob said shouldn't have more than a few, but you do have everything else that are there underneath, think of the pyramid, the benefit is that they are all being controlled and that they're all being monitored. You've got that automated scheduling. You've got real-time analysis so that you are finding out about a nonconformance at the earliest point possible, so you can take a corrective action immediately and then put a preventive action in place. All of that data, again, makes you audit ready on demand, and again gives you all of that information for the trending, the risk assessments, and for continuous improvement. And then you've got on-demand access for that information to respond when FDA walks in and you've got 2 hours, or you have a surprise audit from your GFSI scheme, or you've got a customer inquiry. All of that information is there and ready for you. And as I said, we've got an event coming up that will show you the solution in more detail. Our HACCP and HACCP solution is part of our safety chain management suite called SafetyChain for Food that has solutions for supplier compliance, FSQA program management, regulatory and GFSI compliance, as well as a mobile application for collecting data in the field, at the plant, and in the store. With that, what we're going to do is get to all of these questions now. I'm going to put this slide up. As I said, we can stay on for a couple of extra minutes so that we can get to as many questions as possible. The slides and the recording will be available Monday. As I said earlier, you will be able to download the slides and the recording. You'll also be able to request information for pricing or request a private demo. We've got on May 30th, our FSMA Fridays. We're going to be discussing FDA access to your records, and the Food Safety Chain Management Overview and Demo that I just referred to is on June 6th. You can register for both of these events on our website. If you happen to be attending United Fresh in Chicago in a couple of weeks, please come visit SafetyChain at booth 955. And if you'd like more information about the services that HACCP Consulting Group provide to you, their website and phone numbers there, and we have Bob's address there. If we don't get to you today and you've got some information that you'd like to follow up with Bob, you can contact him directly. So with that, we're going to get to some questions that we have, and we do have a lot of them. So we're going to start with questions from Omar saying, are you referring to prerequisite programs as GMPs, Bob?
Yeah, I kind of use the terms interchangeably, I guess, to address a GMP like pest control, for example. It's important that a company develop a prerequisite program to identify how they're going to address pest control in your facilities. So have an integrated pest management system. So I kind of look at them interchangeably. Prerequisite program, spells out how you're going to meet a particular GMP standard.
Okay. Rogelio, and I'm going to apologize in advance if I didn't pronounce your name correctly, is saying a metal detector is commonly a CCP, but what about screens or sieves that are directly in that process? Would those be CCPs?
Again, I kind of look at, going through the hazard analysis and to identify what your history has been, and using inline screens, if you will. Have you been finding, foreign material and things of that nature, or is it just there as a safeguard? What kind of confidence do you have on your incoming materials and ingredients that they would be free of any foreign material? So, with metal contamination or any foreign material, contamination, I kind of look to what kind of records and what kind of evidence does the company have in advance to make the right decision. If you're always having foreign material contamination problems, either through your incoming ingredients or through the manufacture process or by customer complaints, then certainly it would be justified to have the screens as a CCP and put in some kind of monitoring step. But again,
question from Peter, Bob. What are common pain points with CCPs? And he said, are they things like time to results or detection capabilities?
I'm sorry, Barbara, could you repeat that?
Sure. Peter is asking, what are some of the common pain points that are associated with CCPs? Are they things like time to results or detection capabilities?
Yes, I would say the detection capabilities. Again, a good example would be metal detection. Some companies rely on publications from FDA on what they would take regulatory action against if a foreign material, metal or glass or hard plastic would be in a product. They would set that as their critical limit, whereas other companies would use the sensitivity to metal detector with the seeded samples of ferrous, non-ferrous, and stainless steel as their critical limit. So those standards would be considerably less than what would be necessary perhaps to cause injury or illness, but it varies with the companies.
Mark is asking, should the critical limit be the legal limit? So, for example, he's saying if the cook temperature for chicken is 165, what should your critical limit be?
Well, certainly the, case of chicken, for example, FSIS has validated, critical limits for cooking various products, both meat and poultry, and those have been, validated for many years. So most often companies, just rely on those temperatures, times and temperatures. Companies can use another time and temperature combination provided they have supporting documentation and validation data that it's acceptable. In the FSIS regulations, if a company does not use one of the validated cooking times and temperatures that appear in what we call Appendix A, they have to meet a certain performance standard. For cooked poultry products, your validation data has to show at least I believe a 7-log reduction of salmonella. So that would entail validation studies and such to demonstrate a process other than what's in Appendix A is acceptable to meet that performance standard.
There you go. Wendy is saying our USDA inspector is asking for the validation data for our HACCP hazard analysis, and this information cannot be found. They are allowing us to do another 90-day validation. How do you suggest they start?
Without knowing the particulars, I'm not quite sure. I guess one of the first things I go to is internet to see what's available out there. On our website, the last slide there, we have a pretty good link to a lot of resources dealing with HACCP. We also have a link to some validation tools that you might want to take a look at to see if those would help you. Such things as the USDA pathogen modeling program and things of that nature that might be able to help you develop the necessary validation data that the inspector is looking for.
I love this question. Given today's food safety world, GFSI schemes, and customer expectations, is it possible, Bob, to have a HACCP plan without CCPs?
I would say there for certain processes, there's probably systems out there, processes that would not require a CCP. Now, that would be totally based on, some of our conversation earlier, that as long as you have good prerequisite programs and good GMPs in place, and those are functioning properly, there may not be a need for having a critical control point.
Mm-hmm.
The flip side, I guess, is that, if these prerequisite programs and GMPs are not functioning properly, then, you can't rely on them, and you have to basically elevate the situation to make it a CCP.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay. Thank you. Lot of information. We are at the top, just about at the top of the hour. We still have quite a few questions. If you need to leave us now, thank you so much for your time today. We hope that you found the information valuable. We do have the questions, so if you can stay on, Bob has graciously agreed to stay on with us. So for those of you whose questions we didn't get to, if you can stay, we'll stay. We've got the questions. If you absolutely have to leave, when you get the recording, you'll be able to hear the answers to the rest of these questions. So thank you for those of you who are leaving us. And for everybody else, we're going to just keep on going. Bob, Gary is asking, what is the difference between HACCP and HACCP?
Well,
I know that we can and we have spent a lot of time on that.
Yeah, right.
At the highest level.
I find it interesting in that, even the FDA officials kind of use the term or acronyms interchangeably. I think the only thing that's missing in HACCP is the HACCP principle dealing with critical control points. They're calling them preventive controls. To me, it's the same difference. The 7 HACCP principles.
Not all preventive controls have to be critical control points, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, Gary, if you go to SafetyChain.com and go to our resources section and go under recorded webinars, we had a HACCP HARPC, what are the differences and how to get from one to the other. So that recording is on the website, because it is. And I think that was another one that went over a good 15 minutes, because that's its own whole topic. So that's another resource for you. Beth is asking, Bob, are all food processing plants always required to have floor drains?
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah. Of course, a lot of it would depend on what your local and state regulations or requirements would be, but in a food processing plant, of course, one of the key things is making sure you clean and sanitize your equipment adequately. And of course, depending on the size of your operation and such, I don't know how you can do that without having floor drains. So I think those are almost essential in a food processing plant, certainly from the cleaning and sanitation standpoint.
Okay, and then let's see, I lost my Q&A tab there for a moment. Aaron is saying, what is the best way to actually demonstrate management commitment? I know that a lot of GFSI schemes, it's kind of required. What are some best practices to actually demonstrate it?
Well, one of the key things I think is to provide employees adequate training. To have a ongoing, robust training program, and it doesn't have to be sending people all over the country to training programs and such. But I think one of the best things for management to do is provide adequate training and resources for their people, for their employees. Of course, signage and those other things are important as well, but and just to have a culture of food safety like we've talked about. One of the things that we talk about in our HACCP training program is, employees tend to emulate their boss. So employees need to see that their superiors are committed to, producing a safe product as well. But training to me is one of the key things, and providing enough resources, particularly in time, for the HACCP team, for example, to do what's necessary to develop and implement the programs.
Do you have any suggestions? This is a question from Malaya. Do you have any suggestions for an R&D facility? She is saying, with all of the alterations we make to processes every day, it's hard to have a consistent program.
Yeah, it probably would be, well, it depends on what you're doing with the finished product. If it's, if it's just, R&D and it stays within the, R&D laboratory or facility, that's one situation. If certainly it's intended for other uses, that's still a second thing to consider. You probably could have a, I guess I'd call it a generic HACCP plan that would cover maybe the essentials of the process, and depending on what changes were made, you could put things in and take things out, sort of. But it probably would have to be a fairly generic HACCP plan to be able to function properly.
How would you validate rare earth magnets, and would you have the magnets as a CCP? This is a question from Alex. Yeah,
I've seen rare earth magnets kind of way upstream in the process. What I'm thinking of is basically a pasta process. That they did not have them as critical control points because they were way up in the front of the process. So I'm not quite sure how you validate it. I guess would probably look to the manufacturer of the equipment to get their thoughts or input as to what kind of tests you could run on the magnets to demonstrate they serve their purpose.
Interesting. Excuse me. Question from Mira. How often should we validate our CCPs? Is annual validation required? Is there a common industry standard?
Well, the answer to the last part is no. There's certainly not an industry standard by any stretch. Certainly, your validation data, as required by both FDA and FSIS, the companies have to do what we call an annual reassessment. And during that time, you would want to reassess that, what validation data you have is still applicable and still reliable. If you find situations where that's not the case, then you have to do something additional. But the annual reassessment would really trigger whether or not you would need to do more. Some of the validation is or can be quite costly, and it's not maybe something you're going to be doing very often, provided there's no changes in the process.
Okay. Rachel is asking, what are best practices for developing a corrective action when a CCP fails? Well,
it's another part of HACCP that kind of bothers me a little bit. One of the big benefits of HACCP is to predetermine what you're going to do when you fail at a critical control point. What are the steps involved in taking corrective actions. And oftentimes I see in companies' HACCP plans that's pretty weak, and it doesn't really give people responsible enough tools to know exactly what they do or have to do. Other cases, employees will take action that hasn't ever been addressed by the HACCP team or considered as being adequate by the HACCP team. So, there's a lot of variables, but, knowing your operation and knowing what, potentially could go wrong or has gone wrong in the past, should enable you to come up with, some pretty good steps to take in different scenarios in terms of, the corrective actions.
Marianne, I think that does it. Marianne is asking, how does the team decide what the effect could be to consumers? What makes us qualified to say it will or won't hurt someone? What type of information should we provide in our plan, or should we be reaching out for expert validation and input?
Yeah, that's a tough area for sure. Obviously, if you're marketing it to a certain population, that's one scenario. If your products are going to the general public, it's very, very difficult to know exactly who the consumer is. If you're marketing it to, say, the hospitals or people like that, certainly, you probably need to build in extra safety measures in the process, or you're marketing it to children or something of that nature. You have to make sure that the product's safer than what would normally be consumed by the general public, if you will. So, difficult question to answer.
Is it acceptable to include prerequisite programs as part of control measures?
Well, your prerequisite program more than likely would be a control measure. You cannot rely on a prerequisite program to deal with what we call a reasonably likely to occur hazard. If through your hazard analysis you've identified, reasonably likely to occur hazard, particularly microbiological hazard, for example, at the cooking step of a cooked product, you cannot control that hazard through a prerequisite program. That has to be controlled through a critical control point. So, and again, it's all in the wording of the hazard analysis and in the justification of your decisions. But a prerequisite program or a control program cannot be used to say you don't have a CCP.
Okay. Another question here saying hazard analysis includes biological, physical, and chemical risk. Is FSMA adding radioactivity? Is that going to be the fourth risk?
Yes, I believe that is addressed. I think probably because of Fukushima in Japan primarily, that they expect at least that hazard, radiological hazard, to be addressed. And depending on your process, certainly it might not be an issue at all. If you're dealing with seafood, that may be something of a different nature.
Sure.
Yeah, they have added that to the list.
Beth is asking, how do you determine if a cleaning chemical is safe for use in a food processing plant?
Well, you certainly need to work with your supplier. Your supplier should have documentation and supporting data to say that this is approved for use in food contact or food processing establishment, food contact surfaces and the like. So it would all be dependent on, you know, what your chemical supplier would provide you. And, you know, if they are hesitant or don't want to do that, you probably need to find another supplier, some reputable chemical supplier that, you know, works a lot with the food industry, that knows what's expected and what's required.
I think we've got time for about one more, and if we did not get to your question, but as I said, we've got copies of all of the questions, and we'll try to get an answer to you afterwards, or you can email that question to us. You see Bob's there, or you can email it to me. It's just Levin@safetychain.com, and we'll get those answered for you. But James is asking, will the FSMA requirements change the auditing programs for foreign facilities?
Oh boy, yes, absolutely. Of course, through FSMA, the preventive controls GMP and preventive controls regulation or proposed regulation, that's going to be applicable to any company exporting product to the U.S., exporting food products to the U.S. And there's some 300,000 approximate number of companies that would be impacted by this. And FDA certainly came out with another set of proposed regulations dealing with supplier verification programs, foreign supplier verification programs, that lays out a whole structure for audits of importing companies. So that's just a huge area. But companies that are currently exporting food products to the U.S. under FDA jurisdiction are going to be required to follow the same final rules as the domestic plants.
Yeah, it's going to be very, very interesting.
It's going to be huge. It's going to be absolutely huge.
Yeah, if you're not registered for our FSMA Fridays that we have on or about the last Friday of every month, there's been a lot of conversation about auditing. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of ongoing conversation. When you register for FSMA Friday, you get access to the recordings of all of the past topics, so that might be a place to look too. With that, Bob, this has just really been very, very informative. Thank you so much.
Okay,
I hope you'll
welcome.
come back and
Sure.
interview with us again. And to all of you who have stayed with us for this great webinar, have a great weekend, and we hope to see you online at another Safety Chain leadership event soon.